Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Center for Ukrainian Studies at the University of Manitoba Faculty of Arts. We have a video conference with Dr. Serge Cipko entitled Starving Ukraine, the Holodomor and Canada's Response, a discussion. Dr. Cipko is Assistant Director Research at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. He is the author of Ukraine in Argentina, 1897 to 1950, The Making of Community in 2011, and St. Joseph Anne Ukrainian Catholic Cathedral, Edmonton, a History, 1902 to 2002. And also he's co-author with Glenn Roberts of a book entitled The One-Way Ticket, The Soviets' Return to the Homeland Campaign, 1955 to 1960. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Serge Cipko give this presentation on an important topic in Ukraine and in Canada itself, sponsored also by St. Andrews College and the Center. Welcome, everybody. Dr. Cipko.
To begin by thanking the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies for organizing this video conference. And I would just like to say a few words about what the book is all about. And I'm just going to hold up the book for you all to see. And I'm also going to say a few words as to why I chose the time frame. So that's the beginning of 1932 to the end of 1934. So in one sentence, the book is an examination of both Canada's reporting of the famine. Hello? Can you see me okay?
Yes, everything's okay.
Okay. The reporting of the famine and the country's response to it. The book's bibliography lists over 90 titles of newspapers and magazines. And just to give you a few examples, these include newspapers such as the Toronto Star and the Toronto Telegram, the Charlottetown Guardian in the Maritimes, the Calgary Herald in this province, Alberta, the Daily Colonist in Victoria, British Columbia, the major newspapers in Winnipeg, Saskatchewan, and Edmonton, also some smaller newspapers such as the Vegreville Observer here in Alberta, French language newspapers such as La Liberté of Winnipeg, and La Presse and Le Devoir of Montreal, and of course the major Ukrainian language newspapers of Canada such as Canadaiski Farmer and Ukrainsky Holos of Winnipeg, Nowy Szlach of Saskatoon, Ukrainsky Viste of Edmonton, and the pro-Soviet newspaper, Ukrainian language newspaper, Ukrainsky Robitnashi Viste. I also looked at the pro-Soviet Russian language newspaper Kanadsky Gurok of Toronto, which was the organ of the Russian Workers and Farmers Clubs at that time, in the 1930s. I am not going into great detail about the archives that I mined for the study, except that it, of course, included various collections in Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa, and among others, I looked at collections at Ostoredok in Winnipeg. And from this variety of sources, I was able to gain an understanding of how much was known in Canada about the famine and the kinds of responses there were to the Holodomor. So some of the examples of the responses include about 80 protests that were staged across Canada in 1933 and 1934. And on the level of politicians, there's some examples of the statements made by the mayor of Winnipeg, Ralph Webb, in early 1933, a discussion about the famine in the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan in March 1933, and Member of Parliament Michael Luchkovich's speech in the House of Commons in February 1934. Michael Luchkovich was an American-born Ukrainian, and he was the Member of Parliament for the riding of Vegreville. He was in fact, the only Canadian Member of Parliament at the time of Ukrainian origin. Now, there are many themes that for a moment, I want to touch on one of them. The question of how one responds to a humanitarian crisis. Back in November 2016, Carol Sanders of the Winnipeg Free Press asked me some questions about the Holodomor, and she quoted me thus: "When we're confronted by catastrophes even today, it is always a challenge to many of us as to how we are to respond." End of quote. Now, for the book, I decided to start at the beginning of 1932. And it was good that I did, because for a few weeks in February to March 1932, when we're talking about catastrophes, the mainstream press were reporting about attempts being made to cross the Dniester River from Soviet Ukraine to Romania. And they were also, as they were reporting on these attempts to cross the river, the Dniester River, they were also reporting on the shoot-to-kill policy of the Soviet guards. So, for example, in February 1932, the Toronto Star reported that 40 Ukrainian peasants had been shot by Soviet frontier guardsmen while attempting a swim across the Dniester River into Romania. They were, quote, "fleeing an impending famine," unquote, as the Soviet government engaged in grain sieges. In spite of the shoot-to-kill policy, the New York Times in mid-April 1932 gave a figure of more than 6,000 people who were able to find refuge in Romania during the winter months. The Romanian Prime Minister told the Parliament in Bucharest that he was going to bring the subject of the shootings along the Dniester River to the attention of the League of Nations. The Soviets, for their part, blamed the Romanians for the crossings. They charged that Romanian agents were conducting propaganda among the kulaks in the Moldavian Autonomous Republic within the Ukrainian SSR, and were helping them to cross the Dniester River in groups. So you can see here two things. On the one hand, the fact that the Romanian Prime Minister Nicolae Iorga was taking this matter to the League of Nations, and on the other hand, the Soviet regime putting the blame on the Romanian government for these crossings. Well, the deaths that occurred were one matter, because there were many people who were unable to, who were killed before they could make it over to the Romanian side. And but then there was also the matter of what happened to the people who managed to successfully cross the Dniester River. Many of them were wounded and were now in Romania as refugees. So here in Canada, the Ukrainian community, there was a reading about these attempted crossings, both in the mainstream press and in their own newspapers. And they were reading alarming reports that the Romanian authorities were sending back to the Soviet Union Ukrainian refugees who could not be supported. And these kind of stories appeared in the Ukrainian press in Canada, and it also appeared in the Ukrainian press elsewhere, whether in Western Ukraine or in other countries of Ukrainian settlements. Now, in this particular respect, Ukrainians abroad could and did help by sending funds, by raising funds and sending the money to organizations in Romania. Now, what is interesting in this particular story is two things. On the one hand, it actually disappeared from the mainstream press by April 1932. And on the other hand, there was a lot of interest in those refugees in Romania because they would give first-hand accounts of what conditions were like in Soviet Ukraine. So one example that I want to share with you is that in spite of the fact that there was minimal interest in this story after April 1932, one of the reasons why there was minimal interest is that it seemed that the Soviets and the Romanian side were setting up a commission, and that they would deal with it themselves. You know, the Ukrainian diaspora, you know, we're still taking an interest in what was going on, and in the stories that could be related. Some other journalists, some journalists did as well, did this. But I want to share with you one story that about the Ukrainian refugees that was published in the Manchester Guardian newspaper, and this was from a letter that was to the editor that was submitted by Louise Gibson of the Ukrainian Bureau in London, which was headed by the Ukrainian Canadian Vladimir Kisilevsky. And she quoted from a letter that the Bureau had received from a refugee in Bucharest that was dated the 25th of August 1933. So this was already some months after the stories about well, actually more than a year after the stories had appeared in the mainstream press in February and March 1932 about the crossings. This letter appeared in the 2 September, the 2nd of September 1933 edition of the Manchester Guardian. And the letter said that when the Soviet government started the grain collections the previous autumn and winter, they, quote, not only took the surplus grain, as they called it, but took absolutely everything to the last grain. Nothing remained for the peasant unless he succeeded in hiding something for himself. Hunger had already started last autumn, and after Christmas, deaths occurred from starvation. At first, there were single instances, and then they became more frequent, and now they are dying in countless numbers. In one area north of the Crimea, corpses remain unburied because there is no one to bury them. They decay when they fall, and when they are buried, they are put in graves of 20 or more. You will find whole families of peasants at the railway stations, hungry and scantily clad, peasants and their children. Many parents desert their children and go looking for bread, commit suicide, or die when starvation claims them. End of quote. Now, in the book, as mentioned, I start at the beginning of 1932, and I discuss these attempted Dniester crossings. But I also relate the case of Ukrainian farmers in Canada who, in the summer of 1932, offered to assist people not in Romania, but in Soviet Ukraine, and they were turned down. As I note in my book, that offer stemmed from a district meeting of the Ukrainian Self-Reliance League of Canada in Hartford, Saskatchewan. The Canadian Red Cross Society contacted the Alliance of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies of the USSR. The Soviet reply was sent from the Canadian Red Cross in Toronto to the office in Calgary on the 20th of October 1932. In the reply, the Alliance of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies of the Soviet Union asserted that the offer was, quote, not necessary in the absence of real need, unquote. From a letter published in the Edmonton Journal later on, we know that the Ukrainian community in Western Canada was ready to arrange for 400,000 to 500,000 bushels of wheat to be shipped to Ukraine. Well, Mennonites in Canada were also aware of the situation in Soviet Ukraine. Many Mennonites had come to Canada from the Ukrainian SSR as recently as the 1920s and were receiving letters from relatives there pleading for help. Excerpts of their letters were translated into English and made their way to the letters page of several mainstream newspapers. Mennonite leaders also tried to get the attention of prominent federal politicians, and as it turned out, they were more successful in getting the attention of provincial politicians, especially in Saskatchewan. So in the book, I discuss how in the middle of March 1933, the Saskatchewan MLAs were discussing the famine, and they came up with a proposal that that grain be shipped to Ukraine, and that this grain be offered as barter, and that way it would benefit both sides. But during the discussions itself, they were ready to offer grain to anybody who needed it, the starving people in Ukraine, free of charge if necessary. Anyhow, now nothing came, as I mentioned, from this offer from the Ukrainian farmers, and in fact, there was some discussion. But but after the offer was made, or the resolution that was passed in the Saskatchewan legislature, again, there was some talk, but nothing concrete came from that proposal either. Now, one of the problems, of course, was that the Soviet Union denied that there was a famine, and you can see from this example that it denied that there had been a famine already when the Ukrainian farmers had approached the Soviet Red Cross through the Canadian Red Cross, the Red Crescent and Red Cross Alliance of the Soviet Union. So after Ukrainians had received the reply from the Canadian Red Cross, they could see they could tell that if the Soviets were not allowing grain were not accepting any help, then they had to find a different way of dealing with this particular problem, this humanitarian crisis. And the way that the Ukrainian Self-Reliance League in particular, but all the Ukrainian organizations except the pro-Soviet ones, responded was by protests. As I mentioned at the beginning, there were about 80 of those protests. They were organized mostly by Ukrainian groups, organizations, but not exclusively. And they did get the attention of the Canadian public. So any protest that was staged in Winnipeg, for example, would command the attention of the Winnipeg Free Press or the Winnipeg Tribune, which at that time existed. A protest that was staged in Edmonton would get the attention of the Edmonton Journal or the Edmonton Bulletin, which no longer exists, but existed at that time. A protest that would take place in Vegreville or in Wellington would be reported in the Vegreville Observer, and so on. Now, I want to go back to the question of the time frame selected for the book, and if I decided that I would begin with the beginning of 1932, I decided that I would end with 1934. And again, it was good that I did, because the League of Nations discussed the famine twice. Once in September 1933, and then again in September 1934. Now, there was a difference between the discussion in September 1933 and the discussion in September 1934. In September 1933, it was a focused discussion, whereas in September 1934, the famine was mentioned by the Swiss delegate to the League of Nations, and also by the Canadian delegate during debates about whether to admit the Soviet Union into the League of Nations. So it wasn't a focused debate about the famine, but the famine was mentioned during the course of the debates. Okay, so in September 1933, the Council of the League of Nations debated what to do about the famine, not publicly, but behind closed doors. And it was decided that because the Soviet Union was not a member of the League of Nations, there was actually nothing that the League could do. And so they referred the matter to the International Red Cross. And in the book, I discussed, what the reaction to this was in the Ukrainian Canadian community, which by now is very frustrated because any efforts that they made to get the Canadian Red Cross involved was stymied by the lack of cooperation on the Soviet side. So when they heard that this matter was referred to the International Red Cross, they were of course disappointed. And so this was a theme that runs through this whole story, and that is that time and again the Ukrainian community would make reference to that first offer of help in the summer of 1932. And that wasn't the last time that the matter was referred to either the International Red Cross or to the League of Nations. Okay, so I end the book with the debate over the admission of the Soviet Union to the League of Nations, and the Canadian delegate went on record about the fact. He mentioned that that there was a lot of anxiety about the Soviet approach to allowing relief to be sent through to the Soviet Union, and they hoped that if the Soviet Union would be admitted to the League of Nations, then they would cooperate on this matter. Any time that that people thought that aid had to go through, then it would. Now, I should just say, and this is going to be my last point, and I will take any questions, that the Soviet Union did have one system of allowing people to be helped, and that was through the so-called Toksin system. The Toksin is an abbreviation of the Russian I'll just translate it, trade with foreigners. And what happened is that monies would be forwarded from abroad to the Toksin supply house in Moscow, which had distribution centers across the USSR. Now, can you still hear me okay?
Yes, we're still online.
Okay. Okay, now that's better. Okay. So there was this high-pitched sound.
Yes.
So through the Toksin system, a person here in Canada could send money to the Toksin supply house of Moscow, which had distribution centers across the Soviet Union, including in Ukraine, and a relative could go to this Toksin store somewhere in Ukraine and get some aid that way. Now, the problem there was that it was on an individual-to-individual basis. And so when the Ukrainian-Canadian press learned about the Canadian delegate's speech about aid getting through, and they made the point, one of the problems was that, okay, so what do you do that this Toksin system may work, or aid may work, on an individual basis, but what do you do when they didn't know the addresses of all those people who were in need? And that was one of the problems that the Ukrainian community would note, and it remained a problem. For example, you could say that there was aid that was being being set by Ukrainians in Canada, individually through the Tocsin system, through committees in Europe. But while it could save the lives of thousands or a certain number, it could save the lives of millions. And that's why there have been all these protests drawing attention to the plight of Ukraine. Okay, I'll end there, and feel free to ask any questions.
Professor Cipko, thank you for the overview about the book. I know it's just a recently published book that you just put out with a lot of details about the Canadian perspective on Holodomor. You mentioned 1932-34 as the areas or the dates that you were primarily looking at, or the period of time. Are you planning to look at any prior periods or after that period of time? Because I'm sure there were Holodomor issues prior to 32, possibly. And are you going to be looking at that maybe in a future publication?
Yes. No, I'm not planning to go before or after, mainly because it was clear that the Holodomor itself was considered as something very, very major in 1933. Once we follow those protests, for example, about the famine, I think the earliest one was in February 1933, and they went all the way into the middle of 1934. What I do plan to do, it's just a plan at this moment, is to follow this study up with an American sequel, because there were two matters that did appear in the mainstream Canadian press and also the Ukrainian language press, and that is the matter of Roosevelt recognizing, the United States recognizing the Soviet Union, which they did. They did in later on in 1933, in spite of protests by Ukrainian Canadian groups, but also in spite of protests in the United States by Ukrainian American groups and others. And the other matter with the United States is precisely the major demonstrations that took place there. The demonstrations or the protests that would take place in Canada would encompass several hundred people, and I think as many as 1,500 at one time. But in the United States, they actually had street demonstrations in New York and in Chicago, and the number of people participating were anywhere from 8,000 to 10,000 in New York, and around 3,000 in Chicago. And those protests, or the protesters there, the demonstrators there, these are street demonstrations, were attacked by pro-Soviet groups. And the reports about the protests were published in American newspapers, but also in Canadian newspapers, and in newspapers outside of North America altogether. So that is where I hope to go next. As far as the period before and after, of course, it's still going to be very interesting. But some other scholars have looked at that period. Yas Balan has written an article in Canadian Ethnic Studies about the period before the Holodomor, and Boris Martinovich has written a book on Ukrainians in Canada that encompasses the 1920s and 1930s.
Just another question for you. Do you plan to share your findings? You mentioned Ukraine, which will be happening at the end of June. Since it's a very important topic that is being now currently taught in a number of Canadian schools and even in universities, do you feel it's important maybe to have an opportunity to share that document, the book that you produced, at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, and maybe the Kyiv one also museum?
Yes, so in terms of presentations that are coming up, I do have one in Toronto on the 12th of April, and I also have two presentations in Ukraine. One at a Canadian Studies conference in Lutsk, and another one at a humanities conference in Lviv. And I hope with these two presentations I plan to deliver in Ukrainian, and I hope that it stimulates some discussion, because where the book has a major strength in terms of the sources that were used from the Canadian side, there aren't as many sources that are used from the Ukrainian side. You never know. You never know whether some people in Ukraine might, in hearing the presentations, may think of some sources or some archives within Ukraine, which could shed some light on the topic as far as relations with Canada or otherwise. The one area that I found puzzling at first, when I was engaging in the study, is the fact that there were references to all these letters coming from Ukraine to Canada. Well, I mean, in some cases from other parts of the Soviet Union. And I was often asked, well, where are these letters that came from the Soviet side? And I was asked as well in previous presentations, how did they get through? And it was a very perceptive reporter for the Calgary Herald who made the point that, there is a reason that they would get through, and that reason is that they wanted people to spend to send foreign currency to the Soviet Union, and so they encouraged, or not so much encouraged, but they allowed these letters to get through. And so the other question was, were these letters censored? Well, I think that they were, in spite of the fact that they were talking about all these appalling conditions, because there were, from what I have seen of the letters, and I've only seen one genuine letter. Actually, no, I've seen several. One genuine letter written in Serge, Ukrainian Russian mixture, and some letters written in German. Those are the original letters that I have seen. But from the translations into English of other letters, that were then published, excerpts of which were then published in the mainstream press, or in the Ukrainian press, Ukrainian language press, there is a pattern. And that pattern is that they talk about conditions, they make very major appeals and say, please send us aid, otherwise we're going to perish. But they don't tell you why there is a starvation, or there may be the occasional hint, but they don't tell you what's going on, that's why they are starving. They just tell you that they are starving. So I guess that I have known in the past that there have been scholars who have researched and found confiscated letters in the archives in Ukraine, confiscated letters from the post office. And I just wonder if there are any that pertain to that period, 32, 34.
Professor Cipko, on behalf of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for, I know you're busy, you have a busy schedule out there, but thanking you at least for the time that you found to share information about your current research, your book, that we're hoping to get a copy here as soon as possible, so that we can look at all the other themes that you briefly did not mention, but it would give us a little bit more insight about the details about the book itself. But it was a pleasure to have you basically available to us and share that important information. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you very much for providing this opportunity, and likewise it was a pleasure speaking with you.
And we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sure.